I'm going to follow up a little bit on the two partnership coordination models that Severin was talking about. As he mentioned, there were two models, and we particularly did our evaluation in the 2014-15 school year. So FEND had 11 vistas placed in 11 schools, and they were spread throughout the city. The vistas were placed there 5 days a week in their school, basically essentially full-time. SEPSI had 2 coordinators who were serving 6 schools that were concentrated in South Philadelphia, and this meant that the coordinators spent a few days a week in each school as opposed to being there full-time. And although the two models varied slightly in terms of their assignment, if you will, and like how they assigned the partnership coordinators to schools, the general hypothesis that was really guiding this work was this idea that if you had a partnership coordinator who could serve as a point person or serve as a liaison between schools and partners, it would increase that communication, it would increase some of the alignment, conversations about school goals and priorities, aligning those to also the partner goals and priorities, and then ultimately hoping that you would see some improvements in student outcomes as a result. Our desire behind this was really to learn about the roles of partnership coordination, really thinking about this as an essential function and how this function could be, or these functions actually could be supported in schools. We were very realistic or mindful of the fact that not every school could afford a partnership coordinator, so that 25% earlier, a lot of those people were just taking on extra roles and responsibilities because they're passionate about something, really, are involved and want to give something. So we were mindful of the fact that we were not setting out to study these two models to say, hey, this is how partnership coordinators are going to do their work. We really wanted to be able to come up with something where we could think about how this work could be sustained within budget constraints and the realities and the context of the schools in the district. So when we started our evaluation team met several times with the directors from FEND and SEPSI and also from Vicki's office and with Vicki's staff, and we jointly came together with the evaluation plan to come up with it together. And what we ultimately decided we were going to focus on is really trying to understand the roles and functions of the partnership coordinators. What was the work that they were carrying on? What did it look like with the implementation of these models in 17 schools? We wanted to document the approaches that they were using and also their successes and challenges. We were very intentional about trying to figure out the best or the most promising features or practices of these two models, and less so about comparing one model against the other. We weren't not setting out to figure out which one was best or better, and is a Vista compared to someone who's working in the community, better or not quite as effective. Throughout all of our data collection, we continued to have conversations with the district, with FEND and SEPSI. They were involved in, feedback on data collection activities, wording, specific things with our data collection instruments. So we did rely on surveys of the school staff, partnership coordinators, and partners. We did observations of school-based partnership meetings in 15 schools. We interviewed 12 principals, all 13 partnership coordinators from these two models in that school year, and we also talked with 31 individuals from partner organizations. And we used these data to help us understand those roles and responsibilities, to get a sense of successes and challenges with implementation. And also, throughout this, we paid a little bit of attention to what were some of the tools and resources that folks were relying upon. What were they using as they were doing this work? And that helped inform the toolkit, which I'll talk about in a bit. So throughout our data collection, we learned that the partnership coordinators took on multiple roles and responsibilities in their schools. Their primary function was to serve as that liaison between school and external partners. They played a large role in raising awareness of partner resources, so helping school staff, parents, and community members become aware of the various resources and programmings and activities that were taking place in the schools. Several coordinators helped to conduct needs assessments, trying to get a sense of gaps and overlaps of the services that were in the schools. Oftentimes, they helped to follow up those conversations to match partner services to those school needs, whether it was with new partners or potentially sometimes with existing partners that maybe just didn't realize that there was a need that was present or evident in the particular school. Another key function, and one that certainly took a lot of time, was the coordinators were responsible for facilitating the communication and collaboration between partners. So this oftentimes took place in frequent meetings. Both models tried to encourage at least monthly partner meetings where all partners in a school came together, but there was also ongoing communication that took place, sometimes with individual partners, sometimes with smaller groups of partners who were maybe providing similar types of services, or maybe who were serving similar children or families, or maybe even working with particular grade levels or classrooms. So trying to have some of that more targeted conversation. The coordinators used a lot of different ways, methods, every strategy you could name for communication. So social media was a really big push. There were newsletters and websites. They were trying to get the word out to increase the parent and community engagement. And oftentimes we found that a positive side effect of this is that some of these newsletters and other tools were also being used even just to help school staff and partners become aware of some of the things that were happening. You know, sometimes people are so laser focused on what they're doing and how they're trying to improve the lives of the kids that they didn't always stop to figure out part of a much bigger thing that's happening here. So that was certainly something that a lot of the coordinators took on. And throughout our data collection, we heard a lot about the skill sets and characteristics of individuals who could take on this coordination role. So we heard about the importance of clear communication styles, being very organized and being able to stay on top of things, being reliable, that when somebody said they were going to follow through with something, they actually did that. I know it sounds simple, but trust was a huge thing, so that you said you're going to follow through and actually doing it came up a lot. You know, awareness of schools and district systems, resources, and processes was something that really came up a lot. Especially when you had coordinators who were new, maybe in a one-year position, or not all that familiar with the district or the communities. That sometimes, many times presented a challenge. And we also heard that perhaps one of the best or most useful skill sets and characteristics was being both resilient and flexible. So it took a lot. You're working with multiple stakeholders, a lot of different priorities, agendas, and in many cases, different ideas about what it means to be a partner and what it means to function in partnership within schools. Through our interviews and our site observations, we heard and we saw many ways in which partnership coordination was really paying off, and that there were benefits to school and partner staff. We heard concrete examples of how communication and collaboration had increased and had been enhanced as a result of having that liaison or that point person. It might sound really basic, but partners told us time and time again how grateful they were that somebody returned a phone call or an email, that someone could answer questions about scheduling logistics, use of facilities, competition for school space, especially when you have limited hours, can really be can be a problem. And they also found it was helpful to have somebody who could help advertise program activities and services that the partners had to offer. We have a lot of examples of partnership coordination successes that are in the report, which you can also download from that, the link that's on the back of that flyer I passed out. And overall impressions with the partnership coordination model were pretty positive. 85% of partners reported that they were satisfied or very satisfied with the coordination efforts. 84% of partners reported that these efforts helped to increase their awareness of other partners who were in the school. And then 74% of those partners reported that not only did it increase their awareness, but they also increased their communication, and that they were actually interacting with other partners as a result of this work. So of course, along with the success comes some implementation challenges. Those coordinators who felt that they were most successful in their role described that they benefited from having buy-in from the multiple stakeholders who they worked with. So in cases where there was not a clear and consistent articulation of the roles and responsibilities of the coordinator, it really, it made it difficult for the staff, it made it difficult for the partner organizations. Misperceptions about what coordinators should or shouldn't be doing, who they should or shouldn't be talking to, and how often, really was distracting. It took up very time consuming, so it really took away from some of that partnership coordination function. So that was certainly presented itself as a challenge. Coordinators were charged with establishing, developing new partnerships, maintaining partnerships that they were inheriting or their principals had inherited. In some cases, there were mending relationships. There were partners who felt that they had been slighted, they had been overlooked, underutilized, underappreciated, you name it. There were a lot of, and we could all, partnerships are messy. So there were a lot of, they came with that, but it was, this relationship building came a lot with a lot of trust, and this proved to be a really necessary, a difficult but necessary ingredient for the work that they were doing in the schools. And the coordinators also talked about the importance of developing relationships with school staff. They said that this was really important so that people understood not only that there was a coordinator and a coordination function, but that they could come to understand both the value of that, and they could get to know the coordinator, they could rely on the coordinator to be someone who could help them with permission slip, for field trips, some of those things that sometimes teachers just don't always have the time to do in their day. During our data collection, we also heard about how important it was, critical in fact, that schools and partners had a sense of what it was that they were working on together, right? That there was this need to have clear goals and indicators. Ideally, those would be in place by the start of the school year. If not then maybe by the end of the first month of school. However, we heard that this was really difficult work, even in those schools that had agreed to or had bought into the idea of a needs assessment. That sometimes it could take months to come up with a set of focal priorities that the school and its partners and its staff agreed upon. So even where you had the best of intentions, sometimes this proved to still be difficult work. In schools that could identify and prioritize those, the school needs and how external partners could really help with meeting those needs, we heard from partners and the coordinators and from principals that this helped to pinpoint the gaps and overlaps in service, that it helped to increase the likelihood that partners could work together and maybe could coordinate their efforts, align some of their activities, and that what was also appreciated is that they could avoid duplication of efforts. There sounded like there was nothing more frustrating than putting a lot of time and energy into something and then finding out that somebody else was doing something very similar. So this idea of being able to come together to harness that, that collective effort and the resources, certainly. So something interesting emerged in the data collection when we were asking about this question of school and partner goal alignment. We see here that 84% of the coordinators reported that they agreed or strongly agreed that through these coordination efforts, the alignment between school and partner goals was really, was increasing. It was better. Only slightly more than half of the partners who responded to the survey reported the same. So maybe the partnership coordinators were more optimistic about the work they were doing. Perhaps. It's possible that individual partners, they themselves with their organization did not experience that alignment. And it's also possible that those partners from where they sat with their work and their portfolio of work, that they did not maybe benefit from that big picture that the coordinator had. The coordinator's trying to help align lots of different organizations and partnerships and the goals to the school goals. So it's possible that those coordinators sort of felt that or experienced a little bit more. Let's see. Another thing that we learned was that the school and community contexts were really, really difficult to navigate. In cases where an individual understood the school, the community, the district, it really helped them to understand what they were working with, and then you needed someone who was also skilled at figuring out how to include multiple partners, stakeholders, interests into those sometimes messy, difficult contexts. And as I guess just to stop for a second to really underscore what we learned from this is that I think that this really solidified our understanding and sort of our hunch when we went in that partnership coordination does not have to be done by a single individual, right? You can actually find a few individuals who have strengths in maybe various parts of these functions. And in a lot of schools, we actually learned about where coordination was shared, oftentimes, by folks who held this informal role. And even in those 17 schools where there were assigned partnership coordinators, there was very often somebody who had been doing this work, right, who was still sharing some of that, the coordination responsibilities, sharing institutional history, knowledge, context, information about relationships. So we did see cases where this did work together. So as we wrapped up our evaluation, and we shared the findings with FEND and SEPSI, with the funder, who I should have said this earlier, the William Penn Foundation, and also from the Office of Strategic Partnerships, we had this question about, how are we going to help people understand, how are we going to take this research and put it into practice? What's the most important thing that we want people to learn? So throughout our data collection, it became really clear that in the 17 schools, there was a similar set of stakeholders in almost every school who were working on partnerships, but that they behaved in very different ways in individual schools, right? So you always had a school principal, some level of school staff, you always had a partner organization, multiple in most cases. In the schools we were in, there was always a partnership coordinator, and the district provided a lot of supports, some of which Severin talked about earlier. But the way in which these folks worked or didn't work together really seemed to be dependent on a lot of the school climate, instructional, well, maybe I should say leadership styles, and some of those just sort of idiosyncrasies that you see in schools. So that was certainly something to pay attention to. And as we started thinking about we spent the last year focusing on partnership coordinators and coordination. We really decided that coming together with some type of a guide to help folks think through the multiple stakeholders who were doing this work would be more beneficial than just focusing in on the partnership coordinator. So we really wanted to develop something that that people could use, recognizing that they were not likely to have the funds to pay for a partnership coordinator. And there wasn't a single document that existed at this time to help guide these conversations or decisions between these various stakeholders that we're talking about. So we set out to develop a guide. And you can, the guide is available. You can download it at the back of the website that you have there. So the guide begins with an overview of the purpose, the audience, and the uses of the toolkit. The guide's target audience include the school staff, the school leaders, teachers, and other school staff, partner organizations, and then if you have someone in that playing that coordinator role. The guide includes an overview of elements of school-based partnerships, which were drawn heavily from our research that we had done over that particular year. There's a set of stakeholder roles and responsibilities. You can see these little icons here for those individuals, and it sort of lays out what folks should be doing as part of this effort to develop and maintain partnerships. There's a set of stakeholder discussion guides, so sample conversation topics and questions that people can engage in. There's a toolbox with resources through each of the elements. There's a checklist for developing, coordinating, and maintaining partnerships, such as a little one-pager. And then there's also highlights from the school-based partnership coordination in Philly. So based on the one-year study that we did, there's some just highlights sort of, from the field, if you will, examples that are in there. So now I'm going to jump in and tell you a little bit more about the toolkit in particular, or the partnerships guide. So we did use our evaluation findings, but we also reviewed a lot of other literature and many existing tools and resources. I think one thing to underscore is that a lot of this stuff existed. We got it into this toolkit, but this stuff, most of it was out there. So it was a matter of trying to corral it and bring it all together, including a lot of the things that were being used and were developed for the coordination in the two models that we were evaluating. We looked at resources that were developed, by here in the school district of Philadelphia, but also in other school districts that were intentional about, guiding and supporting these school-based partnerships. And when we began this, we started to draft these elements. We didn't want to call them steps. You see them here. We call this the pinwheel graphic. So we have steps that are in teal, and that looks at sort of the systems and processes. Those that are in purple are looking at the management of partnerships. We wanted folks to be able to find multiple entry points depending on your stakeholder role, the particular partnership or school that you were thinking about. So if you were in a given place at a given time, it's important for them to be able to access that. So the first element here talks a lot about what districts and schools can do to set the tone for those partnerships. This includes things like vision for partnerships, mission. How is my school going to engage with partners to really help move the needle with things that are happening in schools? And element one also focuses on how partners can play an important role in helping schools and districts become aware of the services and the programming that they offer. The second element here focuses on assessing and prioritizing school needs, really paying attention to those needs that can actually be met through partnership, remembering that not every school need can actually be met by an external partner. The third element here focuses on partnership fit, right? So how is it that individual partners come to schools, and how is it that those partners can work together to help schools meet their need? Element 4 lays out the expectations for implementing partner programs. It's sort of the who will be served, by whom, when, some of those nitty-gritty logistics. The next element underscores the importance of developing and nurturing relationships. A lot of this really came from the work that we focus on through the partnership coordination evaluation. And I would say a big theme that runs through here is that importance of establishing clear lines of communication and those expectations between partners and schools, and also between partners. And then finally, the last element here, element 6, looks at assessing partnership progress, success, and next steps. So, going back to this idea of the multiple entry points, a new principal who's coming to a school and is just getting the lay of the land might be trying to establish their vision for partnerships, thinking about what does my school really need. They might start at element 1 or 2. You might have other schools where they have a lot of partners and partnerships, but maybe they're not working in any type of a coordinated or aligned fashion. So maybe they would say like, let's slow down. We could take a look at element 3 and figure out who fits and how could they work together. And then there were certainly schools in our who were part of the study who were much further along. They had partnerships that were actually working in somewhat of a coordinated fashion, and maybe they might start at element 6 where they say, let's really start to think about an assessment of like, how are we moving the needle? How is this working together? Is there something we should do different? Are there things that we should replicate from one partnership to the other? Can we share with other schools in our network or other schools in our neighborhoods? So the toolkit is separated by element. So you could go, if you wanted to zero in on element 3, you could start with element 3. You get a little bit of an overview of those elements and also maybe some sub-elements, including what's important. And then we have this section here about stakeholder roles and responsibilities. You see there's an icon for each of those stakeholders. The idea is that people can see themselves and they can follow their icon throughout the document. And with the, we like to think of these roles and responsibilities charts as a resource so people could think about who needs to be at the table and what should they be doing as we're thinking about developing and maintaining partnerships. When we were developing this, we got a lot of feedback. We went through multiple rounds of iterations of this draft, and we got feedback from the coordinators, the principals, and from school staff here in Philadelphia. So stakeholders were involved in our study. We got feedback from obviously the School District of Philadelphia, but also from the Oakland, Denver, and Houston public schools who have some similar partnership efforts going on. And then we talked with several partner organizations from local and national organizations who were not directly involved in the coordination study. And the idea of talking to some of these people who are new to this was to get a sense of if this toolkit were to land in your inbox or on your desk, like, does this feel real? Could you actually use this? So we got a lot of feedback, and before, we just had a lot of conversations to make sure, like, is this the right stuff, or do we have people interacting in the right ways here? And I think this just underscoring from what I said a few minutes ago is that the idea of seeing all of these multiple stakeholders, they all have a key role. They need to behave in similar ways. And I think that, again, we just want to underscore that this partnership coordination, seeing this as a series of functions, not as an individual role or an individual job. It could be held by, several different individuals. So after the stakeholder roles and responsibilities, there's a set of discussion questions here. This is a sample from element 3. But you can see there's conversation topics, and then there's also some sample questions that people can ask. And Vicki can attest to the fact that when I was developing this, I called her one day and I said, I feel like I'm talking to myself as we're writing these questions. It feels so repetitive. But a lot of people told us that it might be helpful, especially if you're a partner organization or maybe a coordinator who's looking for support from the district, just to have conversation starters and prompts, like where do you have to go? And we had a release event for this work last week. William Penn held a really nice event, and there was a team of educators from one of the schools that participated in the study, and they did a role play, and I was thinking, oh gosh, how is this going to play out? I hope they're not going to read this like a script, and they didn't. It turned out really nicely. I turned to my colleague who helped me with this, and I said, wow, it works. So it's meant to spark some conversation. So that's the idea, again, having it here as a resource, as a tool, as part of the toolkit. Within each of the elements, there's also a set of toolboxes. We call it a toolbox. There's resources that are in there. So we have some of those examples and websites, documents from those districts that are doing this work with the school-based partnership coordination. We included many of these tools here actually as an appendix, so we were a little bit concerned about the problem of dead links. We talked to one principal who said, smart educators don't reinvent the wheel. Give us tools and templates to look at and we'll adapt them. So that was very much in the spirit of pulling things together that were out there in the universe. So you have things like checklists, rubrics that can be adapted. You have let's say needs assessment, things about goals alignment. You also have some really very specific examples of here's what an agenda for a partnership meeting could look like. Here's a sample data sharing agreement, a sample MOU. We were talking about that earlier. So when we developed this, the toolkit itself actually went from about 25 pages to over 100 pages. For the printed version of it, when someone prints it out, it can literally be a guide and it can literally be resources that are at their fingertips. The electronic version of it, which you can download online, has hyperlinks that help you navigate electronically. So you can click on, I want to see this sample MOU. I click on it and it'll take you to that part of the appendix. So it is a little easier to navigate. So depending on, if you're somebody who's at your desk, you can certainly use that, but if you're somebody, you can print it out and use that. So I think just last thoughts, sort of thinking about how do you take research and put it into practice. Certainly our hope and our intent was that each of the stakeholders who we featured in this guide, who we do see as key to this work, that they can find this to be a resource and a tool so they can work with other stakeholders, ultimately trying to really help improve or boost student success. Certainly in developing the toolkit, we confirmed that partnerships are really complicated and messy, but that they're almost always worth pursuing. And last week when the toolkit was released, we heard a little bit about not to speak for Vicki, but what we've heard is that the school district plans to, wants to treat this as a living document. It's a resource that will eventually be posted on the website. Potentially it could be used as a training tool or as a resource for principals, for those partners who are coming in and saying, I have this service, I want to partner with schools. The William Penn Foundation, who is our funder for this, and then also some other philanthropic organizations have mentioned potentially using this or viewing this as a resource or a support for their grantees, many of whom they give money to go partner with schools, go do your good work in schools. So hopefully that would be a resource there. The Mayor's Office of Education, as many of you know, most of you know, they're working on the Community Schools Initiative. We've had a conversation about potentially doing some training with their staff and thinking about this as a resource. And then even nationally, when we were developing this, one of our reviewers was the executive director from the Coalition for Community Schools. And he mentioned that this is a tool that they might want to use with some of their grantees. And he invited us to participate in sort of a research affinity group for the research wonks out here who get excited about that. So other people who want to talk about this too. So it's something, we're looking forward to this, and I think we very much need to continue treating it like a living document. Even we finished the presentation last week and someone said, you really need to add a section about where people can go to look for money to do this work. And funding is certainly an important piece of this, but we'll continue to treat it as a living document.